Good afternoon, I'm Judith Rowland-Jones, Head of Curriculum for Languages here at AQA. Very warm welcome to you today for this introduction to our new draft GCSE Spanish specification. The purpose of today's session is to give you a detailed overview of the draft AQA GCSE Spanish specification. This draft specification and our specimen materials are currently with Ofqual and will be accredited in time for the start of next term. As you will know, French is already accredited, so the assessment model, format of the papers, and the assessments and assessment criteria are already approved, so we know these won't change. What is different, of course, are the Spanish-specific materials, for example, the listening and reading tasks, the speaking tasks, and the writing tasks. If you haven't already looked at the specimen papers, these are available on our website on the new GCSE Spanish page, along with the draft specification, which contains the vocabulary list and the grammar requirements. There are lots of positive things to share about our new specification today, and I also want to highlight the fantastic support package planned for AQA teachers, as well as some key dates for you to be aware of. At the end of today's webinar, there will be a chance for you to ask any questions, and Ian, Chloe, Sadaf and Marjana from the AQA curriculum team are joining us to help you with the answers to your questions. A summary of the questions and answers will be shared with you before the end of this week. Our Spanish specification has been written with the aim of encouraging students to enjoy their language learning and to realise how important learning a language is in life. We want them to be able to use language for authentic purposes and to be able to speak and write about things which are of interest to them. It's also really important to share the culture of the countries and communities where Spanish is spoken and develop their cultural curiosity. The whole process of our development has been informed by practicing teachers at every step of the way, and a huge thank you to those of you who came along to our feedback events and shared your views on our materials. The student experience has also been at the heart of our development work. Our draft papers were trialled with students from a range of school types to inform the development of the assessment tasks, and we also trialled our assessment criteria to ensure they differentiated successfully between students of different abilities, a really important feature of ensuring our assessments are valid and reliable. We use accessible and appropriate language in a clear and consistent way in our question papers to ensure that students are not disadvantaged. We've ensured that our content meets our commitment to equality, inclusion and diversity and reflects the needs and experiences of all students, whatever their background. Here you can see that we have 4 papers and each paper is worth 25%. This specification is tiered, as is the current specification, which is an Ofqual requirement and applies to all exam boards. Each paper is out of 50 and we have scaling on paper 1, foundation listening only. The grading system is exactly the same as we have currently. Here we have the 3 new assessment objectives. So AO1 refers to spoken language, AO2 to written language, and AO3 covers grammar and vocabulary. This table represents the final component weightings. Most of the AO3 marks, so that's marks for knowledge and application of vocabulary and grammar, in our assessment are allocated to paper 4. Our assessment model allocates the highest proportion of AO3 marks of any of the exam boards to the writing tasks. This is with the intention of helping students to perform at their best. Being able to reflect on their use and accuracy of language in their writing tasks is much easier to do in paper 4 than in paper 2 speaking. Students can develop the correct exam technique to check their work carefully in their writing exam and improve their chances of scoring higher marks. We also have a fully equal split of AO2 and AO3 in paper 4, so this assessment model gives a very good balance across the 4 papers in terms of allocation of the different assessment objectives across the tasks, and the student experience has been a key focus in our development. Here are our 3 themes and the topics which sit under each of the themes. These are very broad, and remember, it is not intended that the themes and topics will be specifically referenced in all assessment tasks. The themes and topics are the vehicle for delivering the vocabulary and grammar, and students will be expected to use this vocabulary and grammar across a range of contexts and assessment tasks. This slide highlights the grammar requirements, and these are the same for all exam boards. The main point here is that it is receptive and productive knowledge in this specification. We will be producing a great resource for you which will summarise these grammar requirements. SSC's sound symbol correspondences are tested specifically in the dictation and the reading aloud. This slide summarises the vocabulary requirements, so how many words at each tier, and also the proportions of words that need to come from the top 2,000 most frequent words according to a corpus. No prior knowledge is assumed, and there are 30 multi-word phrases and 20 cultural items in addition. Some more information here about the vocabulary requirements. I just want to pick out here that students can use whichever pronouns they prefer to meet our commitment to inclusivity, which has been a key part of the development of this new specification. The last bullet point mentions the interactive vocabulary list, and that's proved to be very popular. If you haven't seen that already, you can find this on the new GCSE Spanish page on our website. It's a really great resource, and it'll save you a lot of time in terms of how you want to sort the vocabulary to suit your needs. So here we have some more information about vocabulary requirements. So all exam tasks can be answered using the defined vocabulary for each tier, but equal credit is given for any language used beyond the defined content, but that fulfills the tasks. The exam tasks have to come from the prescribed vocabulary list, apart from the dictation task and the Paper 3 inference tasks. Cognates have to be listed in the vocabulary list, apart from in Paper 3, where up to 2% of words can be cognates from outside of the vocabulary list in a single text. Here we have some information about glossing, so that's providing the English meaning of a word in the reading tasks. And proper nouns, so for example, something like Madrid would be deemed to be easily understood, and a noun like Alemania would be glossed because that would be deemed not to be easily understood. We're moving on now to look at the individual papers, and paper 1 is the listening exam, and this slide provides a summary. In the listening comprehension tasks, students hear each utterance twice with carefully adjusted pauses to ensure sufficient time for reading the questions and responding, especially where page turning is needed or where written answers are required. Our decision to keep to 2 hearings of each utterance is based on extensive research and consultation with practicing teachers to create the best exam experience for students. To have 3 hearings of every item in the comprehension questions means a far longer listening exam than we have currently, which teacher feedback indicated would be very unwelcome, as students already find the listening test an intense and tiring task of concentration for students operating in a foreign language. The teachers we consulted felt that any longer for a higher listening exam than we have currently was undesirable. The strong view which was expressed confirmed that the tailoring of the pauses was a more important issue, which is something AQA has always done for our listening tests. Feedback also indicated that if students had not understood the extract after 2 hearings with appropriate pauses, a 3rd hearing is unlikely to be any help and simply extends the length of the test, creating additional stress and anxiety for students. It's also very likely that Paper 3 will follow Paper 1 as it does currently, so that was also a very important consideration in terms of the assessment burden on students. It's also important to note that the AQA listening test has much shorter utterances, so students are able to move through the paper confidently without an assessment burden with long assessment tasks. The 2 minutes checking time has been added to support students to allow them to check their work carefully before the exam finishes. And this was something we were pleased to introduce as a direct result of teacher and student feedback, and we're the only exam board to do this. The recording to accompany Paper 1 will be provided after accreditation, along with a version with 25% extra time built in. The AQA papers focus on shorter chunks of language to avoid placing a burden on students' memory, and this makes the tasks more accessible, particularly at foundation tier. This helps students move through the paper confidently, avoids them losing their place in the test, and provides clarity on which questions are answered from each piece of language they hear. Our questions avoid negative constructions where possible for clarity for students and for the purposes of accessibility. The dictation is 4 short sentences at foundation and 5 short sentences at higher tier, which are transcribed in full, but the way we have designed our dictation task means that students who struggle with this task, in particular accuracy, can still be successful. We're the only exam board to have marks for both AO1 and AO3 in this task, so half of the marks are awarded for how well the student has communicated the meaning of the spoken extract, and the other half of the marks are for how accurately they have transcribed the sentences. We're confident that with the split of marks between AO1 and AO3, all students can gain marks from this task and feel successful. At each tier, there are 2 words from outside the vocabulary list, as this is a requirement, and this will be the same in every exam series. The dictation sentences are heard 3 times, first in full, then in short sections, and then for the 3rd time in full again. These are the dictation sentences for Spanish with the 2 words from outside the vocabulary list shown in red. The words chosen from outside the vocabulary list are accessible words with sounds students are likely to come across as part of teaching and learning. The forward slashes show how the sentence will be split when it's heard in short sections, and there is a good range of different sounds within the sentences. So we're now going to look at how the dictation task is marked in the AQA specification. So it's a levels of response, marked grade 1 for AO1 and 1 for AO3. So when awarding AO1, so that's responding to spoken language, examiners look across the whole 4 or 5 sentences and make a judgment around how well the meaning of the sentences has been communicated. This is where the lack of accuracy doesn't impact on meaning, as shown in the Spanish example here. The incorrect spellings make no difference in terms of communication, so students can be credited. This makes the task accessible to even the lowest attaining students. Gaps are treated like inaccuracies, so that encourages students to have a go at all of the words, because attempts are better than gaps, because some of it might communicate, even if it is very inaccurate. When it comes to AO3, no requirement for total accuracy, and this means that students can still be rewarded highly even if they make minor errors, and we've classed minor errors as things like wrong accents and minor misspellings, like writing B for V. So here are the accredited criteria for both assessment objectives for foundation tier as an example. The higher tier criteria are in the specimen papers. Higher tier is marked out of 5 for each assessment objective. The use of 1 mark bands makes marking very simple, and clear descriptors make this a straightforward task. The criteria were trialled with sample student work to ensure that they could be applied consistently and accurately to a range of student answers, and we're very confident in this method of marking the task, and our approach rewards students of all abilities, which is a key requirement of good assessment design. Marking the accuracy like this means that there are no tricky decisions for examiners to make around individual words. For example, how correct does a transcribed word have to be to score marks? So this is one of the example marked responses from the mark scheme, and there are a range of different examples for you to look at after this session. There's no need for students to worry about getting everything totally accurate in order to score marks. So this student, despite missing a bit out in sentence 4 and some incorrect spellings, still gets 3 out of 4 for AO1. The mark for AO3 reflects the fact that there are some grammatical errors, but the student still gets 2 out of 4 for AO3. So overall, this student scores 5 marks out of a possible 8 for this task. The way this task is designed, students of all abilities will be able to gain credit, and it removes potential anxiety students might have about getting everything totally accurate in order to get marks. It will also encourage those students who struggle to attempt all of the dictation instead of just leaving blanks. We're now going to move on to paper 2, speaking, and look at some general points. So we have the same arrangements for the administration of the tests. So tests are conducted and recorded by the teacher within a 5-week window. AQA sets and marks the tests. Timings are the same as the current specification, 7 to 9 minutes at foundation, 10 to 12 at higher tier, but it is now 15 minutes preparation time at both tiers. There are the same arrangements for access to the confidential materials 3 working days before the start of the test period. It's really important to note that for the AQA specification, students can write as many notes as they wish for all 3 of the tasks in their preparation time. Some students might want to write a verbatim response to the role play tasks. Some students might want to just make notes, whatever works best for them. We'll talk later on in the presentation a bit more about notes and how these benefit the students in each part of the test. The student can keep the notes for the whole test, and then these are collected in by the teacher with the stimulus cards at the very end of the test, and then these are retained until results day and disposed of. This allows for smooth conduct of the test and means there's no disruption for the student or teacher. The tasks for the speaking test are prescribed in the Department for Education subject content and are the same for all exam boards. They are not always in the same order though. For our test, as the role play is the only part of the test which is totally prepared in the preparation time, we place this first to give students a confident start to the speaking test. We're going to be looking at each task in more detail in a moment, but this just summarises each of the 3 parts and the recommended times. Part 1 is the role play, which is recommended to take between 1 and 1.5 minutes, but there is no issue if a high attaining student delivers it in a much shorter time and the teacher just moves on to the next task. It is worth 10 marks with 5 tasks, each worth 2 marks, and represents 20% of the speaking test as a whole. Part 2 is the new reading aloud task and short unprepared conversation. This is recommended to last between 2 and 2.5 minutes at foundation and between 3 and 3.5 minutes at higher tier, and is worth 15 marks representing 30% of the speaking test. Finally, part 3 is the photo card discussion, which has 2 elements: responding to the content of the photos and an unprepared conversation. This task is worth 50% of the marks for the speaking test. The total mark is 50, and this is 25% of the GCSE. There's no requirement in this specification to time or adhere strictly to the time recommended for each individual section of the test, but recommended timings are summarised and teachers are expected to give students the opportunity to respond fully to all tasks. It means that the teacher only needs to start timing at the beginning of the test, and the timer doesn't need to be paused at any stage. This useful table is provided in the specification and in the Paper 2 Teacher's Booklet for reference. So we're now going to look in more detail at the role play. So every student does 1 role play, and every role play for the AQA exam is an informal social conversation between 2 friends. We decided not to have any transactional role plays based on direct feedback from teachers and students. Also, to ensure that there are no tricky scenarios which some students, especially those from a lower socioeconomic background, may find unfamiliar or difficult to navigate because of a lack of lived experience. So things like tourist information office, restaurant or hotel bookings, buying tickets, lost property, etc. You may still wish to cover transactional language as part of teaching and learning, but for the assessment, it's a social conversation. This makes the task much more accessible and removes a lot of the worry students shared with us about being faced with a task that they really don't understand or have no experience of. So students will be able to go into the test feeling confident that the content of the role play will be something which is familiar to them from the themes and topics, and that they have the vocabulary and grammar knowledge to fulfill it confidently. Each role play has a question task, which is a requirement of the DFE subject content, and this question can come at any point in the role play depending on the context. The AQA test has only one question at both tiers in comparison to another accredited specification which has 2 question tasks at a higher tier. We know from our experience of the current role plays that students find question tasks tricky, which informed our decision to keep to the minimum requirement. At foundation tier, students are required to speak only in the present tense. At higher tier, students are required to speak in the present tense, and one task elicits either a past or future time frame. I think we're all pleased to see the bullet point tasks in English in this specification for the role plays, which avoids the potential for students to misinterpret the task. We've used very accessible language in the English bullet points to ensure they are straightforward and clear to students. All of the tasks can be answered from the prescribed vocabulary and grammar, but students can respond using words from outside the list if they wish, and this is credited equally. For example, if the student is asked what their favourite sport is, they can answer badminton, even though badminton is not on the vocabulary list. This principle applies across the speaking tasks. Students have their role play card in the preparation time and can write notes as a script if they wish, and then use this script in the test as they can do currently. The teacher role is scripted and must not be changed, so this makes the task straightforward and easy for the teacher to deliver with very little preparation. There are 2 marks for each of the 5 tasks. Here we have an example of the candidate card for a foundation tier role play. So there are very clear instructions to candidates in accessible language. All of our role plays use informal address, but if students use formal address, they can, as there's no penalty. Informal address is much easier. You can see the helpful reminder for students that each task needs a verb for 2 marks, and the question mark clearly indicates the question task. The tasks also specify how much information is required, so there's lots of clarity for students in their preparation time about what they need to do to be successful. Our mark scheme also makes it clear that once a student has fulfilled a task, any other information they might provide is ignored. So for marking purposes, for the second task here, if a student replied, "I go swimming with my friends," the first part of the response, "I go swimming," fulfills the task for 2 marks. Just swimming with no verb would score 1 mark. Here are some key points around conduct of the role play to help maximise a student's opportunity to score marks in this part of the test. So there's no need to time the role play specifically. Start it using the introductory text provided in the teacher's role. Ask the 5 questions exactly as they're provided in the teacher script without changing the wording. You can repeat a question if the student hasn't responded, but if a student doesn't respond after repetition, we would advise you move on to the next question. Once the role play is completed, you move on to the next task. So here are 6 key points in terms of why the AQA role play will be a good experience for your students. The role play is the only task in the test which is fully prepared in the preparation time, so this comes first, giving students that really confident start to the test. All of the AQA role plays are in informal register and are social conversations between 2 friends based on the topics in the specification, so there's no worry for students about unfamiliar scenarios. There's only 1 question task at higher tier, and we know this is something many students struggle to do successfully. We signpost the question task really clearly with a question mark on the candidate card to help clarity on the day of the exam. We also provide clarity that all tasks need a verb for full marks, so students always know how much information they need to provide to get full marks. Students can make unlimited notes for use during the test without any restrictions, and AQA are the only exam board to allow unlimited notes which can be used at any time during the test. So we're now moving on to the second part of the AQA speaking test, the reading aloud of a text and short conversation. So this part of the test is divided into 2 sections. Firstly, reading aloud a text, and it's a minimum of 35 words at foundation tier and a minimum of 50 words at higher tier, and then answering 4 compulsory questions as specified in the teacher's booklet. And these questions are unseen in line with the requirements of the subject content. Each student does 1 reading aloud task, and this is allocated according to the sequence chart. Each text is based on a topic from one of the themes. All of the words used in the text are from the prescribed vocabulary list, and each text tests a range of sound symbol correspondences. There'll be 9 texts and questions at each tier in every exam series. So this part of the test is recommended to last between 2 to 2.5 minutes at foundation tier and 3 to 3.5 minutes at higher tier. But this is only a recommendation, so when the task is completed, you move on to part 3. A student can self-correct or even restart the reading aloud task if they wish, and there's no limit on how many times, but the teacher needs to be mindful of the timing impact on part 3 of the test, which is worth 50% of the marks. A student who spends much longer than the recommended time on part 2 could have a shorter opportunity to fulfill part 3. The criteria are the same at both tiers, so differentiation is by task, and we will ensure through our question paper setting process that tasks are of the appropriate level of demand for each tier. The response to the 4 questions is marked as a whole, not for individual questions, so there is an opportunity here in the AQA test for students to gain quite a few marks responding to some straightforward and accessible questions using the vocabulary and structures from the text if they wish. The text is in spaced sentences to help readability and is in a much larger font, unlike other exam boards' tasks which use the same font size as normal. We wanted to make sure that the reading aloud task was deliverable in all schools, no matter their resources, size or number of students. For the AQA test, students cannot annotate the candidate card they are given in the preparation time. We gave this issue a lot of consideration, and it became clear that we could not provide the appropriate number of hard copies of the different tasks for different schools with different numbers of students, because we would not be able to determine the specific number of copies of each of the cards needed, and we wanted to avoid unnecessary waste. We also discounted allowing duplication or printing of the cards within schools because of the high risk of potential security breaches. In order to support students, we allow an unlimited amount of notes, and also we don't specify what form the notes can take, so students can use their preparation time to write out the reading aloud text if they wish, and annotate it, or use phonetic symbols or notes to help them deliver it. They have 15 minutes in this exam for their preparation instead of 12, so there is time to do this. We're going to look at an example in a moment. The reading aloud text cannot be practiced out loud in the preparation time, but students can restart their reading aloud task in their exam if they stumble, or they can self-correct individual words, and it's the final version which is marked. Being able to restart this task can really help students' confidence and reduce anxiety on the day of the exam. So because of this flexibility, a rehearsal isn't actually needed, and AQA is the only accredited exam board to allow students to restart or self-correct. This is one of the Spanish Foundation tier texts, a very clear layout to support accessibility and readability of the text. A range of sounds is being tested, but all words come from the vocabulary list, so students should be familiar with them. There's clarity for students in that it gives the topic the text is based on to avoid any potential confusion, and also a very clear instruction that students need to answer the 4 questions fully. We've done our utmost to support students in this new task. This is an example of how a student might annotate their own version of the reading aloud text we looked at a moment ago. This uses a more phonetic way of reminding themselves about key pronunciation. It's up to students to decide what works best for them, and this will be part of exam technique. All of the 4 questions at both tiers are in the present tense and have to be asked as they are written. There are no additional questions and no paraphrasing or rewording, so this part of the task is very straightforward from a teacher conduct perspective. Also, in the AQA task, unlike other accredited exam boards, students can keep their copy of the text during the short conversation, and if they want to, they can use vocabulary or short phrases to answer the questions. Other accredited exam boards don't allow the text to be retained during the short conversation. All of the questions are very accessible, open-style questions which cover topic content which will be familiar to students from teaching and learning and allow for development in line with the assessment criteria. If a student doesn't understand a question, the teacher can repeat it as often as necessary, but just 1 repetition is advisable so that timing doesn't eat into the time allowed for part 3 of the test. So here is an example of compulsory questions for the Foundation Task 7. They're very accessible and straightforward, and even the lowest attaining students should be able to respond to them. They're all questions which are eliciting opinions, preferences, likes, etc. So this is something you can prepare students very well for in class. The questions cover aspects of the specification topics which should be familiar to students from teaching and learning. Coverage of common question words will be something teachers can focus on as part of teaching and learning and exam technique, so students can feel confident in their exam. There are 10 marks available for responding to these accessible and straightforward questions. So here are some key points relating to conduct of the reading aloud task. Students will be asked by the teacher in the target language to read the text. Remember, students can restart or self-correct when reading the text. The questions must be asked by the teacher exactly as they are written in the teacher's booklet. No paraphrasing or rewording of the 4 questions is permitted. The questions can be repeated if necessary, but you must not ask any additional questions in this part of the test. So here are 5 key points in terms of why the AQA reading aloud task will be a good experience for your students. The AQA texts are in a large font size and spaced sentences to aid readability and legibility, which is not the case for all exam boards. In the AQA test, there are no limits on notes, so students can use the preparation time to write out the reading aloud text and annotate it to help them deliver it in the exam. They can use symbols or phonetic spellings if they wish. In the AQA task, students can keep the text during the short conversation and use vocabulary or short phrases from the text to answer the questions, and we are the only accredited exam board to allow this. All of the 4 questions at both tiers are very accessible, open-style questions which cover topic content which will be familiar to students from teaching and learning and allow for development in line with the criteria. In the AQA task, there are 10 marks for the short conversation and 5 marks for reading the text, so there is a greater focus here on communication. We're now moving on to part 3 and the final part of the speaking test. This is worth 50% of the marks. It's divided into 2 sections. Firstly, the student describes the content of the 2 photos on the card for 5 marks. And then the second part is an unprepared conversation worth 20 marks. Each student prepares 1 photo card which contains 2 related photos from one of the themes. They can make unlimited notes, and these notes can be used at any time during the task. When the materials were trialled with students, they produced a vast amount of notes in the preparation time, and teachers felt very strongly that there should be no limits in amount, type or format of the notes, because different students have their own preferred method. So it is important they have access to whatever notes they need to be successful. This is unlike the other accredited exam board where there are limits, for example, 1 side of A4 for the whole test. The card is allocated according to the sequence chart, and this part of the test, comprising the response to the content of the photos and the unprepared conversation, is recommended to last between 4 and 5 minutes at foundation tier and between 6 and 7 minutes at higher tier. Students look at the 2 photos on their card in their preparation time and write as many notes as they wish, and they can read from these notes verbatim during the test. The photos are the same at both tiers. They are in black and white, in line with AQA's principle that colour is only used in exams where it is integral to the task, for example in geography where colours are essential for map work. Although the AQA photos are in black and white, this does not preclude students from talking about colours if they wish. Students can speculate about colour, and if someone is wearing a grey shirt in a black and white photo, it's fine to say the boy is wearing a blue, green or red shirt, for example, and this would be credited. This is the same principle we have in the current writing exam for Foundation Question 1, and it works very well. The DFE subject content does not allow any questions to be on the candidate card, and this is the same for all exam boards. In terms of theme coverage, in this exam, at least 2 of the themes are covered in the test as a whole. 1 theme in the reading aloud task and a second different theme in this photo card task. The role play is not allocated to a particular theme and can cover a range of topics and themes within the bullet point tasks. So we're now going to look in more detail at the first part of the photo card discussion, response to the content of the photos. So this part of the task is worth 5 marks, and the marks are for communication only, not quality of the language used. And this is different to another accredited exam board where the marks are split between communication and language. The first question will always be, tell me about the photos, and students can use their notes to respond to this and read from them if they want to. Unlike other exam boards, there are no compulsory bullet points or specific points to be included in the description of the photos. It's a completely free choice, so students can say anything relevant, focusing on areas they feel confident about in terms of the vocabulary they know. This is a very accessible task for all students. As there are no language marks for the description, students can use the same grammatical structure in the same way they can for the current photo card task in the speaking exam and in the foundation tier writing question 1. For example, there is plus noun. So in terms of classroom preparation for describing a photo, students can prepare for this task and the foundation tier writing question 1 in the same way and at the same time. Any relevant content is credited, and an example of content being credited from outside the theme of the photo card could be a picture of some people on a walk, which is allocated to a card for theme 2 for free time activities. A student might say that people go walking to keep fit, so even though that is more like content for the topic of healthy lifestyle in theme 1, it's credited. So there's really wide flexibility here for students to say whatever they like as long as it is broadly relevant to the photos and gain credit for it. This should be a confident start to this part of the test for students of all abilities, because having 2 photos means that there is plenty of content to talk about, and it removes the risk of a student running out of things to say. Students can focus more on one photo than the other if they wish, as long as they say at least one thing about each photo. So again, very flexible. Timings are approximate. This part of the task is recommended to last a minute at foundation tier and a minute and a half at higher tier, and this recommended time is generous to allow for even the most hesitant of students to fulfill the task. As I said previously, if a student does complete the task in a shorter time, you just move on to the next section. This is an example of the instructions given to candidates on their photo card. So it's very clear what they need to do and that they can use their notes during the test. It also tells them how long they need to speak for approximately, and that they need to say at least one thing about each photo. It also tells them the theme of the photo card. So here we have an example of a photo card from foundation tier, and this card is taken from theme 1, people and lifestyle. So students can describe the content of the photos using whichever language they have, and even if it's not part of theme 1, they can still include it in their description. The second part of the photo card task requires each student to take part in an unprepared conversation on any or all of the 3 topics within the specified theme of the photo card. This makes it very flexible. So if a card is on theme 1, then in the unprepared conversation, the teacher can ask questions from any of the 3 topics within that theme at their discretion. For example, in the theme of communication and the world around us, the conversation can be on travel and tourism, media and technology, and the environment and where people live. All 3 topic areas can be covered if you want, giving ample scope for the teacher to find something which particularly interests the student. Marking must stop at the maximum time allowed, but this is the only specific timing which has to be adhered to. When the maximum time is reached, bring the conversation to a sensitive end. So you might say in the target language, for example, "We've now come to the end of your speaking test, thank you." As I said, there are no requirements around covering a specific number of topics or a specific amount of time on a topic, and this makes the AQA unprepared conversation very student-friendly, as this flexibility means that teachers can tailor their questions to the interests and abilities of the students they are testing. They can avoid any potentially sensitive topics for individual students. For example, a student who may have health issues, you may not want to discuss anything around healthy lifestyle. This open and unrestricted format allows students to show their speaking skills to the best of their ability within the time. Some students may be able to sustain a conversation on one aspect of a topic, whereas a low retaining student may need to move across different topics to keep the conversation going. There's some really helpful guidance on questioning technique in the Paper 2 Teacher's booklet, so please do have a look at that in detail after today's session. A very important point is that there is no requirement for questions in any specified tenses in the AQA unprepared conversation, and this is not the same as other accredited exam boards. The AO3 criteria for the unprepared conversation refer only to the inclusion of complex language, and there are examples of complex language in the Paper 2 mark scheme, which does, of course, include the use of different tenses and time frames. It just isn't a requirement in the same way it is for the current exam. No reference to tense usage specifically means the AO3 criteria is less demanding, and it removes a hurdle for students. The emphasis really is on communication. So here we have some key points for conduct of the photocard discussion. Tailoring your questions to different students in terms of their interests and strengths is important. So if they're keen on sport and they have a card from theme 2, ask them about it and use open questions to provide opportunities for more extended responses. For example, tell me about your favourite sport, and then use follow-up questions to generate a flow of conversation. For example, when do you do it? Who do you do it with? What other sports do you like? Are there any sports you'd like to try? Be mindful of any sensitive topics for individual students to give them the best possible opportunity to show their speaking skills to the best of their ability. And remember, be sensitive when ending the test to avoid an abrupt cut-off. Here are some key points in terms of why the AQA photo card task will be a good experience for your students. 2 photos on each AQA card provides plenty of content for students of all abilities and experiences to fulfill the task confidently, irrespective of their background and experiences. The minimum requirement is to say one thing about each photo, which means that students have the choice to focus more on one of the photos if they wish. This removes the risk of students being stuck for something to say. Students can write unlimited notes and read from these in the test. In the AQA test, there is no requirement to cover specific points in their description of the photos, which makes the task very accessible for students, as they can say anything plausible or relevant and focus on what they have the language for. The photos are in black and white in the AQA task, but students can refer to appropriate colours in their description if they wish. In the AQA description of the photos, there are no AO3 marks, so that's marks for knowledge of vocabulary and grammar, so students can focus just on communication, and they can use the same grammatical structure with a noun if they wish. Practicing for this task is also good practice for the writing task at foundation tier, question 1. Students do very well in this task in the current specification. In the AQA unprepared conversation, there is no requirement for questions in any specified tenses. The higher tier AO3 criteria refer only to the inclusion of complex language. This means the criteria is less demanding. In the AQA unprepared conversation, there are no compulsory questions, and the scope of the conversation can focus on any or all of the 3 topics for the theme, which are very broad. So we're now going to move to paper 3, the reading paper, and this slide gives an overview of the structure of the question papers at both tiers. So in section A, reading comprehension, the comprehension questions cover a broad range of different topics and content. We focused on building cultural capital and celebrating cultural diversity within the context of the reading stimulus texts to inspire and broaden students' knowledge of the Spanish-speaking culture and communities. We've included photos where appropriate alongside the stimulus text to provide students with context for places or situations they may not be familiar with. We've also used the rubric to add helpful context to support students. For example, you read about the historic city of Cordoba, a city in Spain, and there is a picture of the city. Our questions avoid negative constructions for clarity for students and for the purposes of accessibility. Translation is in sentences rather than a passage to make the task more accessible, and also students are less likely to miss words out, as they may do when the text is presented as a passage. We're the only accredited exam board to have the higher tier translation as sentences. You can look in more detail at the comprehension questions in the specimen papers on our website. Testing inference is a subject content requirement, and we're testing students' ability to infer plausible meanings of single words from outside the vocabulary list when they are embedded in the context of written sentences. We decided to test inference as multiple choice to make this task sufficiently accessible for even lower attaining students. At each tier, there will be 2 inference tasks in every paper, and there will always be multiple choice. All of the words, apart from the word in bold, cazón, a type of fish, are in the vocabulary list, so students have to use their knowledge of the sentence to infer that it refers to a fish. Using the word mar helps indicate that it is a fish. We're now moving on to look at the writing paper, which is paper 4. So teachers told us that the format of our current writing paper was accessible to students of all levels of attainment, that it differentiated well between students of different abilities, and that students feel successful, so we've retained many aspects of our current writing paper where possible. The foundation tier exam duration has increased to 1 hour and 10 minutes, and the overlap question is now question 5 at foundation tier. There is a choice for students in the overlap question and in higher tier question 3, as there is in the current specification. We're now going to look in more detail at the structure of the foundation tier writing paper. Question 1 requires students to write 5 short sentences about a black and white photograph. This is a familiar task from the current specification and one which students do very well on. There are 10 marks in total. You can look at this task in the specimen paper on our website. Question 2 has 5 short bullet point tasks and 10 marks in total for a piece of writing of around 50 words. Word counts are recommended only, and everything a student writes is marked. We have 5 bullet points to enable us to differentiate between students of different attainment levels. The bullet point tasks are in English and are very open and straightforward, so all students should be able to access them. We're going to look at an example in a moment. Question 3 is new and is a 5-mark grammar task. Students choose a single word from a choice of 3 provided to complete a sentence using their knowledge of grammar and vocabulary. The foundation tier exam time has been increased by 10 minutes to reflect these changes to question 2 and question 3. Question 4 is the translation, which is presented as short, standalone sentences as in the current specification, and all of the words come from the vocabulary list. You can look at the specimen translation in the specimen papers on our website. Question 5 is the overlap question, which is the one which is targeted at grades 4 to 5 and appears also on the higher tier paper. Students have a choice of 2 optional questions and write approximately 90 words in response to 3 bullet points in English. Each bullet point targets a different time frame, present, past and future, and they will always be in the same order in each paper. There is no specific requirement to test opinions separately in this specification, so this is why the number of bullet points have been reduced to 3. We're going to look at an example of this question in a moment. So this is an example of foundation question 2 from the specimen papers. As you can see, the instructions are very clear to students. They're instructed to write approximately 50 words in Spanish, and it tells them that they need to write something about each bullet point. The tasks are very accessible, especially as they're in English. The number of words is recommended, but they do have to write something about each bullet point. But the coverage of the bullet point doesn't have to be equal. That's the same principle as we have in the current specification. There are 10 marks for this question, 5 marks for responding to written language, and 5 marks for knowledge and application of grammar. This is foundation question 3 from the specimen papers. So you can see the rubric for students at the top, along with the example, so that students are clear on what they need to do. And then you've got the first question from the specimen paper. You can look at the remaining questions in the specimen paper on our website. So students need to use their knowledge of grammar to choose the correct word from a choice of 3 possible answers, and then write that word in the space to complete the sentence. It's multiple choice to aid accessibility. An example is provided, as I said, to support students and to provide clarity on what they need to do. The marks for this task are for AO3 only, knowledge of vocabulary and grammar. It's a very straightforward task and one which reflects the aims of the subject content in terms of students demonstrating their understanding of grammar. So here we have an example from the specimen papers of one of the optional overlap questions. It's a very accessible and popular topic. The instructions for students are very clear. They're told to write approximately 50 words in Spanish, and they're reminded that they need to mention each bullet point. The bullet points are in English in very straightforward language, so there should be no barriers to students in terms of understanding what they need to do to fulfill this task. The tasks are in the order of present, past and future, as I mentioned earlier. And there are 15 marks for this question. So there are 10 marks for AO2 and 5 marks for AO3. So that's AO2 responding to written language, and AO3 is demonstrating knowledge and understanding of vocabulary and grammar. This is a summary of the higher tier paper. In this specification, the translation comes first because it's the only compulsory question on the paper. The translation is in sentences rather than as a passage to make the task more accessible and also ensure students do not miss words out as they may do when the text is presented as a passage. AQA is the only accredited exam board to have the higher tier translation as sentences, which we feel is very supportive to students. Question 2 is the overlap question targeted at grades 4 and 5 we've just looked at a moment ago. And question 3 is the more open-ended writing task where students respond to 2 bullet points and write approximately 150 words. During our consultation with teachers, there was clear support to retain the scope of having just 2 very open-ended bullet points to allow students to develop their responses freely and creatively. The first bullet point will always be in the present tense, and the second bullet point will be in a time frame other than the present, and this will be the same in each exam series. There are 25 marks for this question, representing half of the marks for this paper. There are 15 marks for AO2, which was responding to written language, and 10 marks for AO3, knowledge and application of vocabulary and grammar. So this reflects the greater number of AO3 marks in writing rather than in speaking to allow students to reflect on their written language and improve their accuracy. Here is an example of one of the optional questions for higher tier question 3 from the specimen papers. The instructions are very clear to students. They're told to write approximately 150 words in Spanish and a reminder that they must write something about both bullet points. The bullet points, as I said, will always be in the same order, so present time frame plus non-present time frame, and that could be past or future. Like the current specification, students have to write at least something about both bullets, but the coverage can be unequal. So for this example, a student could say, I think technology is important because I need my mobile phone to contact friends, and that fulfills the bullet point. They could then write in much more detail about the second bullet point, and this is the same principle that we have in the current specification. There are 25 marks for this question, 15 marks for responding to written language, and 10 marks for their knowledge and application of vocabulary and grammar. We've now reached the final section of this presentation, and we're going to look in a little bit more detail at the resources and support available for teachers who choose AQA. We've got a guide on our website which outlines all of the resources and support that's going to be available, and it was designed with feedback from over 1,000 teachers. So we're confident that we're going to have all of the resources and support in place to make sure that you can prepare your learners with confidence in the run-up to first teaching in 2024 and first assessment in 2026. And we're going to look in more detail at that support now. So here are some highlights from the resource and support roadmap. First of all, the really detailed look into our speaking test, which we held recently. That webinar is now available on demand, so please do watch that if you get a chance. It's a really useful session and provides lots of helpful information about the AQA speaking test and the benefits of it for your students. The full programme of launch meetings kick off in the autumn term, and there are face-to-face and online options available. So if you haven't booked a place already, use the link here and get that place booked. We're producing schemes of work, a 2-year course, and there'll also be a suggested scheme of work for Key Stage 3, but these will be editable and you'll be able to tailor them to suit your students and your approach. We'll be producing a switching guide to give you a specification comparison between AQA and the other accredited awarding bodies. We're also producing an audio resource, which will be an audio version of the new specification vocabulary list, which will be really helpful for your students. There'll be a tiering guide to help you with tiering decisions for GCSE languages. And in January, we'll have some option evening resources to help students understand the importance of choosing languages. We're also going to be producing a resource summarising the grammar requirements to help you understand what the changes are between the current specification and the grammar requirements for the new specification. So in February, we start our programme of Prepare to Teach events. So these are language-specific events, and again, there are face-to-face and online options available. And as soon as bookings are available, we will let you know. These events will be led by subject experts, and there'll be lots of helpful information provided, including an opportunity to look at some marked exemplar work and have a go at marking yourself. The guidance for teaching mixed ability classes at GCSE will be available in summer 2024, and there'll also be a full package of additional materials to support you and help you prepare your students with confidence for the new exams, particularly focusing on those new elements of the exams, so things like reading aloud and dictation. There'll also be an additional full set of sample assessment materials which will be available for you securely, so you'll be able to use them as mocks with your students. There'll also be mark scheme guidance webinar training to practice marking for the new specifications, and a free on-demand online training for conduct of the speaking test. So that will give some really detailed and valuable advice on how to get the best out of your students in the new AQA speaking test. Spring 2025, we're going to have some lesson plans that focus on areas where there's an opportunity to explore equality, diversity and inclusion. And then summer 2025, there'll be some hints and tips for learners on exam technique in poster format. These have been really popular for the current specification, so that's something we're going to replicate for the new exams. Our new GCSEs will be supported by Oxford University Press. They will be producing foundation and higher books for French, German and Spanish that follow the themes and topics of the specifications. And these books have been entered into an approval process with AQA, so they will be the only books that are approved by AQA. There'll be online resources delivered via Caboodle. And if you've already subscribed to OUP on Caboodle, you will have access to both courses during the transition period. If you want to look at some advanced content, then you're able to do that from October, and you can also register your interest to sign up for printed sample content at this link in the presentation. So here we have some information about support that's going to be available from ExamPro, and I know many of you already do use ExamPro for your students. There will be an on-screen vocabulary tool for years 7 to 11 for GCSE French, German and Spanish, and this will be aligned with the new specifications. This tool will enable you to effortlessly monitor language acquisition. It can be used in class or for homework, and it's going to be mobile compatible. It will also include reports for students and for teachers, so it's extremely flexible. There's also going to be an extensive collection of new question banks featuring specimen papers and specimen questions from a range of content mapped to the new specifications. And this will give you the freedom to craft your own homework and assessments tailored to your teaching approach. And that will be designed to prepare students for the 2026 exams. Ready-made expert assessments will be available for delivery on screen or as paper exams. So ExamPro will also provide unparalleled reporting and insight gathering at the student, class, school and math level, including population analysis. And this will enable you to track student progress and strategically plan interventions for maximum impact. There will be specimen papers for mock exams with plans for a student mark entry app to save you time. There will be tailored solutions for academies and trusts as part of a package of benefits designed specifically. This will include early access to some of the new features in pilots. All of this support will be available from September 2024. This slide just summarises some of the key dates for you. So the German and Spanish specimen papers and specifications were submitted to Ofqual in early July. I mentioned the deep dive into the new GCSE speaking test, which took place on the 11th of July, which you can now watch on demand. The final accredited specifications and specimen papers for all 3 languages will be available in schools in September 2023, 1 year in advance of teaching. I mentioned our launch meetings taking place in the autumn term and the Prepare to Teach meetings taking place in spring and summer 2024. September 2024 is the first teaching of a 2-year GCSE, June 2025 the final exam for the current GCSE, and June 2026 is the first exam of the new GCSE. So we're coming to the end of the presentation now, so I just want to spend a moment thinking about why you should choose AQA for your learners. We've worked with practicing teachers every step of the way to make sure that we've developed a specification that you will enjoy teaching and feel confident delivering for your students. Learners have given their opinions on the topics and themes and helped us to trial our assessments. Our assessment criteria were trialed to make sure they were reliable and differentiated effectively between learners. Our listening exam has shorter extracts and avoids an assessment burden on learners, and we've added in that really helpful checking time at the end of the test. Our dictation rewards communication of meaning as well as accuracy, so all learners can feel confident about being able to score marks. Learners told us they find transactional role plays harder, so all of our role plays are informal social conversations between friends based on the topics in the specification. Learners can make unlimited notes in their speaking preparation time. We want to make sure they have whatever they need to be successful. Learners are allowed to restart their reading aloud task if they need to, and it will always be the final version that is marked. They can also keep the copy of the text to help them answer the questions in the short conversation. In the unprepared conversation in the speaking test, the teacher can ask questions from any of the 3 topics within that theme. This flexibility means that you can tailor your questions to the interests and abilities of your learners. You know your learners best, so you can use your discretion to avoid any potentially sensitive topics for individual learners and also allow learners to really show their speaking skills to the best of their ability. In the photocard discussion, there are no requirements around how many topics to cover or how long you must spend on a topic, so you don't have to worry about stopping and starting during the test. You can really focus on getting the best out of your learners. The translations at higher tier in the AQA specification are sentences, not passages, and that makes them more accessible. Our assessment model allocates the highest proportion of AO3 marks of any of the exam boards to the writing tasks, and this is with the intention of helping learners to perform at their best. If you want to hear more about the AQA specification, please do get in touch using the telephone number or the email address on this slide. If you want to book a one-to-one meeting, we're really happy to do that, so please use the link here and book a meeting with your local representative. Thank you for listening to today's presentation. I hope you found it useful and informative and that I've given you lots of clarity around the different elements of the new exams. Please do take the time to look at the specimen papers and specification on our website and also the helpful item commentaries that give you an insight and some detail into how the assessments have been set. Now we have some time for questions. so please use the question and answer facility to submit your questions. I'm joined by my colleagues Ian, Chloe, Sadaf and Marjana from the MFL curriculum team to answer your questions. We have a lot of people in today's session, so we might not be able to answer all of the questions, but please don't worry if your question doesn't get answered. We'll make sure it's included in the Q&A document we'll circulate to you very shortly. I'd just like to thank you again for joining me this afternoon and wish you a pleasant evening and a lovely summer break when it comes. Goodbye.